Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us bright and early on this chilly morning for our Wake Up with Research series. So my name is Daryl DeWald. I serve as the Vice President for WSU Health Sciences and also the Chancellor of the WSU Spokane campus. So we're excited to be back with you here on campus. We're in full swing with finals coming up and the holiday season. Things are definitely bustling. Before we begin our program, we would like to do a land acknowledgement. Washington State University acknowledges that its locations statewide are on the homelands of Native peoples who have lived in this region from time immemorial. The university expresses its deepest respect for and gratitude towards these original and current caretakers of the region. As an academic community, we acknowledge our responsibility to establish and maintain relationships with these tribes and Native peoples in support of tribal sovereignty and the inclusion of their voices in teaching, research, and programming. For those who have not joined us before, we started this research series 2.5 years ago. We initially launched the series virtually due to the pandemic, but we also learned that many of you like the early morning format. Because of that, we've decided to continue some of the series virtually, while others will now be in person. Our goal is to provide a backdrop for the community to learn more about the research that is happening not only right here in Spokane, but across the WSU system. Our researchers are making important contributions in so many fields, which you'll hear about today. Studies of research range from sleep and performance, to autism, cancer, aging, chronic disease, native and rural health, neuroscience, rare genetic disorders, and yes, so much more. And these are amazing people committed to improving the lives, not only for Washingtonians, but for citizens across our nation. All of this research is looking at complex and life-changing problems that will ultimately enrich the quality of life for those individuals. Before we jump into the program, I want to acknowledge an organization that is also doing its best to improve the quality of life for those in our region and across our nation, specifically for children and their families. Joining us this morning on behalf of Seattle Children's Hospital is Dr. Eric Tom. Dr. Tom is the Senior Vice President and Chief Research Operations Officer for Seattle Children's Hospital Research and Foundation. Dr. Tom, good morning. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Dr. DeWald. Thank you for that introduction. Many of you know about Seattle Children's Hospital and the impact it has had on our region over the last 115 years, which has been continuously enabled by the support of our generous community. Our mission is to provide hope, care, and cures to help every child live the healthiest and most fulfilling life possible. In our research division, which has been around for about 16 years now, moving towards this mission means we are working to tackle many of the same problems that the WSU scientists that you'll hear from today are also focused on, including interventions to reduce childhood obesity, understanding and addressing the disparities caused by social determinants of health, and supporting parents in optimizing their children's social, cognitive, and emotional development. Our research teams are also studying hundreds of other topics, including seeking out causes and treatments for epilepsy, how we can leverage the body's immune system to fight cancer, what impact media use has on children's development, and much more. We are proud to be sponsors of today's event and support conversations like this that highlights how the amazing scientists in our community and state are working to improve quality of life for people everywhere.
Thank you, Dr. Tom, and thank you for your leadership, and thanks for joining us today. We appreciate the sponsorship, but more than that, we appreciate the growing partnership between WSU and Seattle Children's Hospital. We appreciate that on many levels, but today we're going to highlight some of the cool research that is being done and some opportunities we have as institutions. But now I'm going to turn things over to our MC this morning, Dr. Celestina Barbosa-Leiker. Celestina is our Executive Vice Chancellor and She serves as a professor in the College of Nursing. She herself is a great researcher, and I think that she's put together an amazing team today. So thank you, Celestina, and take it away.
Thanks so much, Daryl. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this month's Wake Up with Research. Thanks for joining us bright and early again, if you're returning. I'm excited to share with you our presenters as they talk about their research related to child and family health this morning. But before I introduce our speakers, I want to share a little bit about what got us here. Washington State University is a land-grant university, and the way that we serve our state in the health sciences here is through education of the future workforce of the healthcare leaders and professionals across our state of Washington, across our state here in Washington. We also serve our communities and organizations through our service, those organizations that help serve our healthcare needs, and of course, our research that works to improve the health and well-being of every resident in the state of Washington. Our topic this morning is on child and family health, something that I think we can all agree is needed and is important and near and dear to our hearts. So I'm very excited that we have a great panel of speakers this morning that's going to be speaking on this topic. Referencing this statewide approach, we note that WSU Health Sciences research is being done not only here in Spokane or in Eastern Washington, but really across the entire state of Washington and beyond. We also have clinical sites and partnerships across our state, both in rural and in urban settings. Before we begin, I want to remind you all that you can drop questions into the Q&A section there on your screen, and we'll be monitoring them. We won't lose track of them, and we will be able to ask our panelists those questions live here at the end. So we'll have all the panelists go first, and then we'll do a Q&A session. So please feel free to drop your questions in there at any time. So let's get started. Our first presenter today is Dr. Courtney Meehan. Dr. Meehan is a professor in WSU's Evolutionary and Cultural Anthropology Department, and she's here with us to share her research. Courtney.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me today. I'm thrilled to be here this morning. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Does that look okay?
Perfect.
Okay. Well, again, thank you for having me here today. I'm here to share with you a bit about our research on breastfeeding and human milk composition. So I wanted to start by just talking to you about what the state of knowledge is on human milk. I probably don't need to tell many in this audience, but human milk is frequently the sole source of nutrition in early infancy, and it is the gold standard for newborn nutrition. It's also evolved over millions of years to support the really unique needs of our infants. But unfortunately, we know more about cow's milk than we do human milk. This has been primarily driven by money, but there have been some negative consequences to this, not surprisingly. For example, in terms of breastfeeding and human milk, we don't know why it lowers the risk of many diseases like upper respiratory diseases or later obesity in some situations. We actually don't know the optimal duration around the world or optimal breastfeeding patterns. We don't know why human milk composition changes within a feed or over time. And we don't know whether the significant variation we see in human milk composition around the world is biologically relevant and important to short and long-term health. But what we do know is that human milk is an incredibly complex biological system. The composition of milk is influenced by a variety of maternal factors like diet, genetics, health, stress. It's also influenced by timing, the time postpartum, lactational stage, time of day. It's influenced by infant factors as well, gestational age, size, and possibly even sex. Moreover, all of these factors and milk are influenced by our environmental conditions, our geographic location, our physical, and even our social environments. Individually and combined, these factors are associated with human milk composition in terms of the macro and micronutrients in human milk, our milk microbiome, and bioactive factors in milk like human milk oligosaccharides, immune factors, or hormones. And although we have an enormous amount of work to do, It is hypothesized, these factors are hypothesized, but we don't necessarily know the pathways to influence numerous outcomes like maternal health, infant neurodevelopment, infant growth, body composition, infant immune responses, and even infant gut health. And so my colleagues and I have been working for well over a decade now to untangle some of these questions. For example, my colleague Shelley McGuire and I directed the INSPIRE project, which was a cross-cultural epidemiological study of 11 cohorts in 8 countries on 4 continents. The work from that was among the first to document such widespread cross-cultural variation in human milk composition across numerous factors. And here you're looking at a figure from one paper where we documented variation in the human milk microbiome. And that is all those bacteria that we find in milk, which only 10 years ago was questioned to whether it actually existed in healthy milk samples. The bars are different abundances of genera of milk, and you can see that there are similarities around the world, but there are also tremendous differences. And we are asking whether these differences are biologically relevant to short and long-term health, and whether they are targeted to particular environments. Beyond characterization, we're also conducting studies with data from around the world, assessing how our behaviors and our social environments change our microbiomes. For example, we found that when infants have a lot of non-maternal care, it changes their microbiomes, but even more interestingly, that care changes their mother's milk. Our current milk and maternal infant fecal microbiome study is looking at whether variation in milk in our microbiomes are associated with variation in outcomes like stress, temperament, depression, and behavior. This work has also led us to a variety of more applied projects in the last few years. If you can recall the start of the COVID-19 pandemic really early on, there was some evidence, although the data weren't necessarily rigorously collected, that SARS-CoV-2 might be in milk and might transmit vertically. And there was concern that mothers and infants should be separated. And it's not unheard of. Some viruses like HIV or Ebola have been known to transmit vertically via human milk. But we were able to put that decade plus experience to collecting human milk around the world in challenging circumstances to pull together a multi-institution collaboration to quickly and rigorously study whether the virus was in milk and whether there was risk. And we found that SARS-CoV-2 was not in milk, and milk contained neutralizing antibodies. And so we were able to substantially impact public health guidance in the state and around the world. And mothers were encouraged, if they wished, to continue to breastfeeding with precautions, even if infected. Another applied project is our current work that I'm doing with collaborators, some which are on the call here, where we are examining human milk and cannabis. With expanding legalization, we're seeing increased cannabis use and decreasing perceptions of risk among reproductive aged women. But there is almost no information available for mothers on what those risks are and how they can assess them. And so we're conducting a case-controlled study to examine the pharmacokinetics of cannabinoids in human milk and infant urine, whether cannabinoids are associated with changes in milk composition, conducting preliminary research on whether we see associations with infant development, and we're looking at how mothers are assessing risk and making decisions, which can be highlighted from that last quote. We're just analyzing these data now, so we'll have updates in the near future for you. But that is a brief tour of some of the work that we're doing on breastfeeding and human milk composition. And I'd like to thank you for having us. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions, and below are some of the funders that have been helping us with this work. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Courtney. Courtney is joining us from the WCU Pullman campus, and now we're going to kick it over to the WCU Tri-Cities campus. Our next speaker is Dr. Paul Strand. Dr. Strand is a professor in WCU's Department of Psychology. Paul.
Thank you, Celestina. Thanks for having me. Let's see, I'm going to try to share my screen. Oh. All right. Can everybody see the screen okay?
Looks great. Thank you.
Great. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about research and summarizing some things that we know about families within cultures and cultures within families. Babies form attachments to caregivers. Sometimes they are secure, meaning that they seek comfort from caregivers when scared. Otherwise, they explore. Sometimes attachments are insecure, in which case they may be anxious or avoidant. Anxiously attached children are more attuned to the caregiver and a bit less focused on exploration. Avoidant children appear disengaged from caregivers, even when stressed or fearful. While attachment theory is widely accepted in developmental psychology, it is strongly challenged by some cultural anthropologists who argue that the categories do not apply well to families in non-Western cultures. We have tried to show that not only do the categories apply, but they actually define cultures in the sense that some societies are collectivistic and others are individualistic because they differ in the number of children who are raised to be anxiously attached or avoidantly attached. Consistent with this, cross-cultural research shows similar rates of secure attachment across societies. The number of anxious children, however, is higher in collectivistic societies, and the number of avoidant children is higher in individualistic societies. This makes sense. In the West, we train for autonomy and less so for interrelatedness. The attachment patterns appear to be the basis for many social and economic differences across cultures. Smaller networks and less social trust reduce economic opportunity, but they also help delay the onset of disease in collectivistic societies. By contrast, both money and viruses circulate more freely across individualistic societies. Learning is the key to culture. We largely understand the relationships that give rise to the attachment patterns. They involve how caretakers respond to the child's experience of fear, how consistently or inconsistently that response is reinforced. We see too that certain cultures ritually expose infants and children to fear, anxiety, and bouts of separation. Such exposure predicts the onset of anxious or avoidant attachment styles and is a conservative force within cultures. I share here a picture of rats because they too display something like the attachment patterns in response to the consequences of their comfort seeking under stress. In sum, attachment patterns and cultures run deeper than what is transmitted verbally or represented cortically. They are subcortically mediated too. We seek to understand how fear rituals and nonverbal learning in children impact social behavior and how it has a bottom-up influence on culture. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Paul. Thanks for sharing your research with us. We're going on a little road trip. We're going back to Pullman now. We're going to be leaving the WC Tri-Cities campus, heading back to Pullman. Our next presenter is Dr. Masha Gartstein. Dr. Gartstein is also in WC's Department of Psychology and a professor and director of clinical training. Masha, over to you.
Thank you so much, Celestina, for that introduction. I'm going to share my screen. All goes well. There we go. Is that good?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, fantastic. So the title of my talk is Becoming Who We Are, Origins of Individual Differences in Personality. And so I think of myself as a researcher who's primarily interested in the origins of personality and individual differences in personality. But I study these individual differences before personality per se really comes online. So I'm really working primarily with infants, kids before 3 years of age. And at that point, we refer to these individual differences as temperament. And temperament involves emotional reactions, sort of fear, sadness, anger, frustration, experience of joy, our propensities to have these experiences, how quickly things are done, kind of tempo, but also self-regulation. And when I studied so early in childhood, really the very beginnings of self-regulation. And so that's kind of, an umbrella for my research. More recently, I've become really interested in, coincidentally, after I had my own daughter, I've become more interested in maternal well-being during pregnancy in its own right, and also because of really important connections between maternal well-being during pregnancy and then these temperament outcomes in kiddos after birth. And so especially maternal symptoms of anxiety and depression have been really clearly linked with infants' emotional development, irritability and fussiness, actually across species. So that's another area of my program of research. And I have also, kind of consistent with the talks you've heard already, have had a longstanding interest in looking at development cross-culturally for a variety of reasons, but primarily because if we want to understand if some developmental phenomena is, universal or culture specific, this is what we have to do. And so today I picked two studies to share with you that I think illustrate this sort of array of interest in this program of research. And without further ado, I'm going to dive into this first project that is cross-cultural in nature and is looking at maternal well-being. This is across the US and the Netherlands. So I have a team of collaborators in the Netherlands who help with this work and with a variety of other projects. And I'm showing you data. And one of the neat things about this study, I think, is that you can actually see the differences between the US group of mothers and the Dutch mothers by visual inspection. And what we're calling latent prenatal distress continuum really is sort of in human terms is a combination of what mothers report in terms of symptoms of anxiety and depression. And so mothers in US report higher levels of these symptoms. And you can see also kind of the variability, the spread is greater for mothers in the US. And these are all women in their third trimester of pregnancy. And these samples are pretty comparable across the two sites. I was very interested in these data for a variety of reasons. The study is not conclusive, and so far it doesn't tell us exactly where these differences in prenatal distress and anxiety and depression during pregnancy come from or what they may be related sort of downstream, but it is possible, to speculate a little bit. And so I proposed in this paper that came out in 2020 in the Journal of Affective Disorders, and I will propose to you today that the differences may be at least in part driven by differences in policy, differences in access to care and support that pregnant women receive in the US and the Netherlands. In particular, Dutch women have much greater access to midwives and doulas, and that kind of care is pretty much universal in that country and many others. In terms of downstream consequences, now I have to be clear in that in this particular study, we did not assess infants, we did not look at babies after birth. However, I have another project, another article with the same group of Dutch researchers where we focused on the infants. And in that study, we showed that, in fact, babies in the US are fussier than their Dutch counterparts. Now, that study was an older study, and at the time, I wasn't thinking this difference in infant temperament was driven by maternal well-being during pregnancy. But it's definitely something I'm considering today, and I'm really hoping to follow up on this research, being able to put all of this together in terms of looking at maternal well-being, following their infants after birth, and then also looking at these policies and access to care issues in a more comprehensive kind of way. The second study I'm going to share with you came out recently in the Journal of Infancy, and it really illustrates kind of my interest in infant temperament on both behavior level, so those parts of temperament that we can observe that are sort of expressed and can be observed directly, like emotional expressions. And also the fact that infant temperament can be studied sort of on the neurophysiological level, focusing on brain activity that's associated with temperament. And that's what this project is really about. And I'll say more about specifically what this brain activity entails and kind of how we interpret it. But first, I want to orient you a little bit to this admittedly complicated graph, but we're going to focus really on sort of the red triangle, and I will talk you through the paths that I think are particularly meaningful. So what we're looking at here, first of all, is there's a relationship between the stress that parents experience in their parental role and mindful parenting. I should tell you that mindful parenting in this particular paper, in this study, is very specific to parenting infants. And so it has to do with kind of staying grounded while you're parenting an infant, not approaching them in a reactive kind of way, but being able to reflect, even in a situation where you may have a lot of distress, your baby is crying and you're trying to soothe them, but still really focusing on, what you're trying to accomplish and what's best for the infant rather than just jumping in and just starting to do things. So this grounded reflective parenting of infants is really what we're measuring in the study. And mothers who report higher levels of stress, this PSI taught us like the total level of parenting stress. So mothers who say they're not confident that they're doing a good job as mothers. Mothers who report things like they're not able to do as many things as they had in the past now that, they have the infant to take care of. Mothers who report not being as supported by others tend to be less mindful in parenting their infants. And that's this negative relationship right here. Now, why should we care about that? Well, perhaps most interesting is the fact that mindful parenting is actually associated with this brain activity variable, which I'm going to talk about now. So what we're measuring in the study in terms of brain activity is what's referred to as frontal EEG asymmetry. So we're using electroencephalography, EEG, which is a lovely non-invasive tool for brain imaging. And one of the great things about EEG, it's certainly an older technology, but it continues to be really useful because babies don't have to be perfectly still for us to measure brain activity. So, we can have them in a high chair interacting with their mothers, and we still get good, clean data in terms of what's happening in their brains while, they're behaving and demonstrating their temperament behaviorally. And in this case, what we show is that mothers who are more mindful have infants who show this brain signature that's associated with a greater propensity for joy and a greater capacity for regulation. They're showing relative left frontal activation, to be specific. The other thing that's really interesting about this relationship is because of how we're measuring this brain activity, the implications kind of really speak to infants' ability to cope with stress. Specifically, what's happening in the study is that we're measuring this brain activity in the context of a mild stressor. What's mildly stressful to infants in the lab? Well, we tell the mom not to interact with them for 2 minutes. And the babies definitely do not like it. It challenges their own ability to regulate. And so infants of mothers who are more mindful appear to be coping with this mild stressor in a more proactive and more effective kind of way. And so appear to be, we can say, better regulated in this context. And so I think the other reason why I wanted to focus on these two studies is because they also are very promising in terms of pointing us to potential targets for additional services and intervention. But because I don't have time to get into that, I'll kind of end this description of my research at that. And before I finish, I really want to thank all of my collaborators, some of whom are on this call today. I want to thank my lab. Without these graduate and undergraduate research assistants, this work would not be possible. Of course, our funders, and most importantly, all of the families who took part in this research. And I'm happy to answer any questions either today, later during Q&A, or via email. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Masha. And just a reminder to anybody watching, feel free to put in any questions at any time during that Q&A, and we'll get to that at the end after our last speaker. So thank you, Masha. We are now heading over to the WC Vancouver campus here. We're going to turn it over to Dr. Sara Waters. Dr. Waters is an associate professor in the Department of Human Development on our Vancouver campus. Sara.
Thank you, Celestina, for the introduction and for the opportunity to be here and share my work with all of you today. All right, are my slides showing okay?
Yes, thank you.
Great, thanks. So it's really great to follow some of the wonderful work that Paul's doing because as I think will come through, infant attachment, the quality of the relationship between the parent and the child in early life is really central to the work that I do as well. There's really quite a bit of work at this point, really recognizing that early experiences of stress and trauma shape developmental trajectories, but also have really important implications for long-term health, both physically and mentally. So early stress in children's lives predicts negative physical and mental health outcomes. It's also really clear at this point that the parent-child relationship is a really important factor in how children experience stress, also how they learn to manage or self-regulate in the face of stress, And so a high quality parent-child relationship can buffer children or be a protective factor from the negative health effects of stress. So some of the work that has been emerging from our lab shows that parents' stress can actually be transmitted to their young children through physiological channels. So we measure things like heart rate, cardiovascular system responses in both the parent and the baby or young child. And when we induce a stress response in the parent, we can see it transmitted to or caught by the child. And we see actual changes in their heart rate or different cardiovascular responses in the child as well that really mirrors or echoes the stress that the parent is experiencing in their body. We also find, though, that parents can modify or disrupt this stress transmission through their behavior. So when parents do things like try to suppress or mask, kind of tamp down and not show their stress to their child, that actually exacerbates or increases that physiological stress transmission from the parent to the child. So based on this work, we think that there are it may be counterintuitive, but things like experiencing your emotion, expressing your emotion in front of your child, helping them see the ways that you regulate your emotion is actually a more effective strategy for creating that protectiveness, that buffer against the effects of stress for your children, than trying to kind of keep a smile on all the time and deny or suppress or hide the negative experiences that we as parents might be having. I now want to share a couple of projects that I have going on now that I'm really excited about. The first is a multidisciplinary and multi-sectoral collaboration. So we have two community organization partners, faculty from the College of Nursing and the School of the Biological Sciences, as well as myself and the College of Agricultural, Natural, and Resource Sciences, Connors, working together on a project that was funded actually through WSU's Health Equity Research Center to conduct interviews with Asian immigrant families and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander families on their experiences of racial discrimination, access or barriers to access to healthcare, and how their cultural strengths and family dynamics are protective factors or buffers in these experiences. As part of the interviews that we're doing with families, we are inviting and engaging with families to have conversations about how stress is actually experienced in the body. So we invite folks to participate in hair collection protocols, and we can actually take the hair. So you can see here that a child as young as 8 is very enthusiastic to be involved in providing this hair sample and also assisting the researcher in collecting a hair sample from their mother. And what we can do from those hair samples is actually extract the stress hormone cortisol from the hair that most recently emerged from the scalp. We can determine what the levels of cortisol that have been circulating in the body over the past couple of months. So it gives us a physiological or biological indicator of the chronic stress that these folks may have been experiencing. So we're continuing with this work now, actively engaged in these interviews with the community and finding a lot of interest from families to not only share their stories, but also contribute to the data, really recognizing the impact of anti-Asian discrimination on health and the experiences of chronic stress in the body. The other project that I'm excited to share about is a collaboration with Indigenous researchers at the University of Washington, as well as a tribe here in Washington State, to develop a trauma-informed parenting program. It's called the Steamers Boots program. And it's really a culturally grounded program. And by that, I mean that traditional knowledge and practices and values are centered in every aspect of the curriculum that we have developed. So the program is a gathering, it's a group of parents of young children who meet, six sessions to talk about parenting, the stresses and the challenges and the coping strategies to do that, but all really with a grounding in culture and community practices. So you can see here an example of one piece of the curriculum that we have developed that really weaves Indigenous knowledge with developmental science to support children's healthy development, to heal from trauma, and to really strengthen families and communities moving forward. And this work was funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's Interdisciplinary Research Leaders Program. So with that, I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to share this work today. And as others have said, happy to have more of a conversation offline, answer any questions, or learn more about how we can connect to different communities to support children's health.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. Thanks for sharing your research with us. We are now going to leave the Vancouver campus and head over to Seattle. I think some of you don't know that we do have WSU Health Sciences Spokane faculty in Seattle. We have a research institute there. So our final presenter this morning is Dr. Amber Fyfe-Johnson. Dr. Fyfe-Johnson is an assistant professor at the Elson S. Floyd College of Medicine, and she works in the Institute for Research and Education to Advance Community Health, otherwise known as IREACH. Amber.
Thank you, Celestina. It's wonderful to be with you here today. Today I'm going to discuss a little bit about nature and health in childhood and how to make access to outdoor spaces and the benefits thereof accessible to all children. So I'm going to start just by framing this work around why it matters. And to start, kids spend most of their days either at school or at home. You'll notice in the first bullet that Washington preschoolers spend about 30 minutes of outdoor time per day. That's in contrast to the recommended 2 hours of time that we hope that children spend at school. In regard to the home environment, importantly, low-income neighborhoods are 4 to 5 times less likely to have facilities for outdoor play. And kids spend about 4 to 7 minutes in terms of average daily outdoor unstructured play at home. Lastly, neighborhood greenness is associated with lower BMI or body mass index and physical activity in children. And this really presents sort of the general, what is the problem? And in summary, and this is a very abbreviated summary of the literature, what we know is that kids are not getting enough time outside. We also know that kids from historically marginalized and low resource communities or neighborhoods are disproportionately affected. And so the next question that I go to is, what do we do about it? And I've used the social determinants of health framework, primarily the Healthy People 2030 framework, to inform my work. Many of you are likely familiar with this, but social determinants of health are conditions in the environment where people are born, live, play, learn, grow, etc., that affect health and quality of life. And so nature and outdoor spaces fall in 2 domains of social determinants of health. 1, neighborhood and built environment, and 2, social and community context. So you can imagine a neighborhood park, for example, falls both within the neighborhood, also provides a gathering space for social and community context. The good news about social determinants of health is that they're modifiable. So if we identify something that we could change within the social determinants of health framework, we can modify it and make an impact on the quality of life and health in those communities. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what we know now. The first slide I provided, as I mentioned, a very abbreviated version of the literature. The honest truth is that the literature are quite transdisciplinary and quite large. So when I started this work, colleagues at multiple institutions across Washington state determined that we really needed to summarize the literature because there were so many different publications in so many locations. So this culminated in a systematic literature review published in Pediatrics last year. And in summary, we had roughly 300 papers that we needed to summarize. So it was a very large systematic review, but also exciting to work with colleagues across the state to put this into the body of literature that exists to date. A brief summary of what we found. I'll orient you to the green rows here, is that we determined that there was a high strength of evidence that time outside, nature exposure, increased physical activity in childhood. Also, that it improved cognitive, behavioral, and mental health on average. Remember that children here are broadly defined, 0 to 19 years of age, but nonetheless, broadly speaking, we were enthusiastic that there was a high level of evidence. In terms of adiposity or overweight or obesity status, there was a moderate strength of evidence that time outside or nature exposure improved these outcomes as well. So we walked away from this publication enthusiastic, as I mentioned, also feeling that outdoor time is a necessity. It's not a nicety in child. It's really important, not only for health outcomes, but also other outcomes as well. The question, however, is how do we get kids outside more often and for longer periods of time? So I'm going to talk about one of my current projects, or hop in, health outcomes and preschool innovations for obesity prevention. This is a 5-year NIH-funded project. The idea here is to evaluate the impact of an outdoor preschool model on child health. My community partner here is Tiny Trees. If you look in the picture in the upper left, you'll actually see kiddos who are at Tiny Trees. Tiny Trees is an outdoor preschool based in King County. It's the largest outdoor preschool in the United States with 13 classrooms spread across King County. As I mentioned, it is exclusively outdoor. There are indoor locations for really serious inclement weather, but in general, kids spend all their time outside. The exciting thing about Tiny Trees is they have a very equity-driven model. So 50% of enrollment spots for families are eligible for free or reduced tuition. 40% are families of color. And critically, these kiddos spend at least 550 hours outside over the course of an academic year. That's much different, for example, than the 30 minutes that I highlighted earlier in my talk. So I was excited to work with Tiny Trees, not only because they had multiple locations and a large number of kids enrolled, but they have a real equity-based framework. It's a natural experiment and it's a prospective observational study. So I'm following roughly 200 families for 4 years. I collect data on these families at the beginning and the end of the academic school year, so over the course of 2 years. The outcomes that I'm measuring are broad. Many are relevant to obesity prevention. For example, in the lower left, you'll see a device that I use to measure physical activity. The device in the middle is used to measure sleep. They're both actigraphy devices, but slightly different in technology. So the device in the middle measures both sleep quality and also sleep quantity. And then the golden emoji there in the bottom is indicative of gut microbiome work. So I'm collecting stool samples in all the kids, and again, measuring stool sample composition and microbiome variation over time. I also have a number of behavioral, mental health, for example, stress and resilience, and academic health outcomes. Of course, academic health is relevant to a lot of education-based communities, so it was really relevant to this community. Lastly, I'm hoping that this work has some policy relevance. I'm going to conduct a cost-benefit and cost-effectiveness analysis of this outdoor preschool model, because if there are health benefits, and we know that there are health benefits, and it's cost-effective, from a policy framework, it makes a much more compelling case for a return on investment. I love collaborating, so if you have any follow-up questions or you'd like to work together or just ask more about my work, please reach out. I'd be excited to connect. Celestina, back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Amber. And thanks for all of our panelists. We're now going to jump into the Q&A portion of this. We have some questions that have come in live from some of our viewers. Please also continue to feel free to throw some questions into the Q&A, and we'll see if we have time to get to them. If not, we'll make sure that our researchers are able to reach out to you individually. So I want to start with a question, a heavy question, given just recent events locally and across the nation. And that is some stressful things that we see on TV and that our kids are probably seeing on TV and the news. For example, school violence ending in tragedies. We know this hit very close to home at University of Idaho. Our kids are in active shooter drills. Our kids have probably been in schools when they've had to go on lockdown. Access to news discussing war in classroom, things like that. What can we do as parents or family members, educators, to talk to our kids about these very difficult situations that seem ever present now. Do you have tips for parents or family members or members for our K through 12 community that might be watching this morning on how to address these situations with our kiddos?
Well, I suppose I could start because in the past few days, I live in Moscow, Idaho. In the past few days, I've had this interesting experience of, turning from somebody who's a clinical psychologist advising others on sort of how to do this best to a parent who has a 13-year-old who wants to understand what's happening in her community. And it is a challenge, but I think that, some of the themes that are important that we can kind of be mindful of as we have these conversations are, first of all, transparency in a way that's age appropriate. Now, my daughter, now being 13, knows quite a lot about what's going on. In fact, she came to me with some details that, later came to light, and she has her own network and they're talking about this. So it's pretty transparent at this point and pretty adult-like. I think it's really important to validate, the range of emotions. I mean, yes, this is scary, right? That's clearly kind of one emotional implication, but also it's very sad. It's very sad that, young people now at the University in Idaho, and of course, all over the United States, sadly, have been victims. And I think also we're angry. We're angry that, that this happens in communities over and over again. So acknowledging those feelings and, validating them, I think, is critical. And the other theme that, I try to develop with my kid, and, I think this is something I've also talked about before I sort of became here in the middle of all of this, is that you want to sort of strike a balance between yes, it's, it's important to be careful. We talk about, what I call situational awareness. Something doesn't look right, don't be around it, get away, tell adults, right? Have your wits about you, but also living your life. You can't not live your life because bad things happen, right? Bad things happen. They happen even in small communities like our own. And, we have to do our best to still do all the things that we need to do, while being, obviously mindful of any risks that in our case are sadly ongoing.
Great, thanks, Masha. And we learned, Sara, I think from your presentation too, probably as parents and adults, not to try to hide our stress, right? To be open with it, to acknowledge it, to talk about it so that kiddos can kind of see the full evolution of how we regulate our emotion. That was kind of what you touched on?
Yeah, I mean, I want to be clear that I'm not suggesting that we kind of spew our negative emotions onto our children, right? But that, we all as parents want, I think, to develop emotionally resilient children. And yet we can, with really, well-meaning intention, end up dismissing our children's emotions, kind of like, you're okay, there's nothing to be scared of, like these kinds of messages, rather than letting them see, as Masha was saying, like there's fear and there's anger and there's upset that we as the adults are experiencing. We can be the role models of emotional resilience by recognizing and acknowledging those feelings in ourselves, which gives children permission to have those feelings as well. And then helping them see what we do about it. How do we take care of ourselves when it's scary? How do we take care of ourselves when we're angry and maybe feel helpless, or powerless in a situation? And how do we stay connected to our lives and the good things, as Masha was saying, like we don't let this control us. We, as role models of emotional resilience, that's a very powerful way to socialize our children to be emotionally resilient.
Great, thank you. Okay.
If I can just add one more thing, the notion of balance between safety and living your life, I think, is the key, and it's hard to strike that balance. But with very young children, one of the things that you want to do is talk with them about their own agency and how it is that you can work together to be safe and live your life. So by agency, what I mean is that sometimes young children, you'd say, well, what are the things that we're doing to stay safe? How is it that we as a family, what processes do we have in place? We have locks on our doors, and just letting kids be able to explore that and be able to even come up with their own suggestions of how to stay safe and to maintain that balance.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks for the three of you for weighing in there. Courtney, I have a question. A question came in actually about your work on milk composition. Can your research on milk composition be used to develop new and better formula alternatives?
Yeah, I am so grateful for this question because this is really at the forefront of my mind when I'm doing this work, particularly in terms of documenting and characterizing variation in milk composition around the world. I think that it is our goal to be able to understand milk so that we can also provide the best alternative for the millions of moms and infants who choose not to or cannot breastfeed for a variety of personal, cultural, medical, environmental considerations. There's a whole range of decisions that women make or need to make, and those need to be respected. And so when we're doing our work documenting human milk composition, that definitely is in the forefront of my mind, because the better we can understand what normal milk composition looks like and where it varies and why it varies and whether that's biologically relevant, the better we can help develop the best alternative to human milk for infants around the world.
Great, thanks so much. Amber, there is a question for you here in the Q&A. Is your study collecting any data relevant to the question of wildfire smoke and its effects on lung function and health in general? Seems especially relevant to an outdoor school.
Great question. My current project that I review does not, but some current projects that are under review at NIH do. So you can get a rough assessment of air quality through AQI or air quality indices, as many of you likely know, in addition to measuring, for example, quality of soils. So looking at a more comprehensive perspective of not just is somebody outside or not, but looking at the quality of the outdoor space in terms of air, water, soil, and also greenness. So you can look at geospatial analyses. So you can look from a crow's eye view or a 30,000 foot view and look at total greenness in a census tract or sometimes even a zip code. So looking more comprehensively at environment beyond just is a kid outside or not.
Great, thank you so much. Well, if you can believe it, we're out of time. I think we could go on and on with this great discussion on various aspects of all of your research. I want to thank all of our panelists here this morning for sharing your research as it relates to child and family health. We hit on a whole lot of different topics, but some pretty great themes threaded throughout each presentation and in the Q&A. A great virtual round of applause for our researchers, Drs. Meehan, Strand, Gartstein, Waters, and Fyfe-Johnson. Again, thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise with our community. This is our last Wake Up with Research for the year. So we will be back in 2023. Our January Wake Up with Research will also be virtual. The topic will be climate change, and then we'll be back in person. So we had our last event that was back in person here on the Health Sciences Spokane campus. We'll be back in person on March to talk about healthy aging. If any of the viewers want to follow up on things that we discussed today, please feel free to reach out. And we're happy to connect you with a researcher so that you can engage in getting your questions answered. I also want to give a shout out to our sponsor, Seattle Children's Hospital Research and Foundation. We truly appreciate your support. Thank you again to our panelists and to our guests. We look forward to seeing you again virtually in the new year. With that, have a wonderful day, stay healthy, and go Cougs. Thank you.